let's talk about the HVAC market. Now, I know what you might be thinking, air conditioners, furnaces, but this is a sector that's actually a huge indicator for the whole economy. And after 2025, a year of just massive upheaval, everybody's asking the same question: what's coming next? So, to figure out where we're headed, we have got to understand the shockwave that just rocked the entire industry.
And to really get the scale of what happened, you just have to look at this number. In the last quarter of 2025, the HVAC giant Carrier saw its residential sales absolutely plummet by 38%. I mean, that's not a dip, that's a free fall.
And this wasn't just some isolated Carrier problem. Nope. Their big competitor, Lennox, reported a 32% drop in their residential volume in the very same quarter. You know, when you see two of the biggest players in the game post numbers like these, you know something big is going on across the whole market.
What's really telling, though, is that even the people at the very top were caught completely flat-footed. Carrier's CEO, David Gitlin, basically admitted it, saying, "We all got surprised by the magnitude of this thing. So this wasn't some slow, predictable downturn. It was a sudden, sharp shock to the system."
And if we zoom out from just those companies, the picture gets even clearer. The entire industry shipped 2.2 million fewer units in 2025 than it had been recently. In fact, it was the lowest number of units shipped in a single year since all the way back in 2016. So the big takeaway here is that this was a truly historic slump. The question is, why? What caused it?
Well, to answer that, we've got to deconstruct what some people are calling a perfect storm of factors that all slammed into the market at the same time in 2025. It really wasn't just one thing, but a whole combination of pressures.
We can basically break it down into four key areas. First, you've got a supply chain mess called distributor destocking. Second, a housing market that was basically frozen solid. Third, some really shaky consumer confidence. And finally, you had some regulatory and political headwinds messing things up. So let's dive into each one.
So, what on earth is destocking? Well, imagine a giant traffic jam in the supply chain. Distributors had overordered, right? So their warehouses were just packed to the gills. To clear all that out, they slammed on the brakes and stopped ordering new units from manufacturers like Lennox and Carrier. This created this huge, temporary clog in the system. The next huge factor was the housing market. And honestly, this quote from Home Depot's CFO just says it all. He described the U.S. as being in a frozen housing environment for 3 years. And think about it. When people don't move, a major reason for buying a brand new HVAC system just vanishes.
And you can see this trend so clearly in the data. Back in the year 2000, people moved on average every 4.2 years. But by 2025, that number had more than doubled to a record 8.6 years. People are just staying put, and a lot of them are trying to squeeze every last bit of life out of their old HVAC unit.
Which brings us to our next critical piece of the puzzle, the homeowner's psychology. Because even for the folks who weren't moving, there was this growing feeling of, hey, maybe I shouldn't spend a ton of money right now. This was all driven by a major crisis in consumer confidence.
At the start of 2025, things looked fine. A slight majority of Americans, 51%, felt it was a good time to buy big-ticket items. So the sentiment was basically a coin toss. But then look at this. Fast forward just 1 year. By January 2026, the number of people who felt it was a good time to buy had just collapsed to 32%. Now, a full 2/3 of consumers were saying it's a bad time or they just weren't sure. That is a massive psychological shift against making big purchases.
So why the big change? Well, according to Joanne Ha, who runs the University of Michigan's Big Consumer Survey, it really boils down to one thing. People were just frustrated with high prices. Even when fears about future inflation started to cool down, the pain of current prices was very, very real, and it made people clutch their wallets tight.
And then, layered on top of all this economic anxiety, you had one final ingredient of uncertainty, and this one was coming from the political debates swirling around Washington, D.C. over energy policy. This made it incredibly difficult for both consumers and the industry to plan for the long term.
You essentially had two completely different visions clashing. On one side, you had the argument that new energy regulations and rebates were forcing people to spend money, driving up home prices, and putting too much stress on the electric grid. On the other side, the argument was that these programs actually save consumers money and are crucial for helping families afford new, efficient systems. This huge debate over federal programs created a ton of wait-and-see hesitation out there.
So, that was the perfect storm of 2025. But what about the year ahead?
Is the market finally starting to thaw out, or are we in for some more frost?
Well, there are some signs of cautious optimism. The investment bank William Blair, which keeps a very close eye on the industry, said that they believe the market is finding a bottom. And after a year like 2025, just stopping the free fall is the first real step toward a recovery.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. The official forecast from an industry leader like Carrier is still very, very cautious. They're predicting that volumes could fall another 10 to 15% in 2026, and that's assuming that things like interest rates and consumer confidence don't really change. So it looks like the recovery is going to be a slow grind.
Now, if we look even further down the road, beyond 2026, the entire long-term forecast really hinges on one key dynamic. It's this constant battle in a homeowner's mind. Do I repair my old system, or do I replace it completely?
And according to Carrier's CEO, the replace decision is bound to win out eventually for three big reasons. 1, the cost to repair old systems is just going to keep going up. 2, that frozen housing market has to thaw out sometime. And 3, and this is a big one, the refrigerant used in older systems, R410A, is being phased out. That means it's going to get way more scarce and way more expensive over time. That alone is going to force a lot of people to upgrade.
Which leaves us with the million-dollar question for 2026. We know the market is trying to find its footing. We know there are millions of aging systems out there that will have to be replaced eventually. But with consumer confidence still so fragile, is this the year homeowners finally bite the bullet and replace? Or will they try to squeeze just one more year out of that old system? The answer to that is going to define the entire year ahead.